I'm Danny Sheehan. I'm the fellow teaching the course and learning from you guys as we go along as to how much of this stuff you guys have already figured out. This course is primarily designed to integrate the relationship between the major global climate change that's going on right now already, what's getting ready to happen with regard to it in light of the lack of effective measures that have been taken to deal with it so far, and what relationship that might have to the potential impeachment of Donald Trump. That you see various Democrats taking a number of different passes at getting to happen. And how that all relates to the uprising at Standing Rock. The Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation, which you'll hear a lot about during this course, actually started racially profiling the Lakota people up there as religiously driven, anti-capitalist, indigenous jihadist terrorists. And that you'll come to understand why it is they prismed the indigenous people like that, because the founder of the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation, U.S. Army Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Jim Reese, was the director of worldwide anti-terrorism operations for Blackwater International. And prior to that time had been the liaison between in Afghanistan and Iraq, between the American Central Intelligence Agency and the Joint Special Operations Command of the U.S. Pentagon. So that this privatized military operation that was undertaken against the indigenous people perceived all of the indigenous people as just an extension of the indigenous people around the world that they found encumbering the access of the oil corporations to the oil and other natural resources in those countries. And so that, at the beginning of a course like this, people would be wondering what that operation up there in North Dakota had to do with the potential impeachment of Donald Trump. And it might be a little more obvious how it all relates to global climate change. But what we're going to be doing during this course together in the 10 weeks is we're going to be analyzing each of these three phenomena and understanding what the interrelationship is among them all. Okay. Now that this particular course, it's got the 20 lectures that we're going to be having here, and then there are historically, this is the 5th time I've been teaching here. They're all different courses. The Trajectory of Justice course is what this is. And I'm given permission by the university to fill in what the trajectory of justice is in any given springtime. And as you know, the trajectory of justice now in the country is largely influenced by the fact that we have the most reactionary United States Supreme Court that we've had here in the United States since 1937, with the appointment of Kavanaugh. And the Trump administration is in the process of appointing 236 new federal judges. The right-wing Republicans in the Freedom Caucus helped block all of the judicial nominations of Obama virtually in his second term. So there were 140 vacancies in the federal court system when Trump came to office. So he had a laydown on being able to nominate 140 new federal judges, and the Senate was under the control of the reactionaries in the Conservative Party, and a fellow by the name of Orrin Hatch from Utah was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee that is the one that provides advice and consent to the nominations of the president for the Supreme Court. And so it was there under McConnell, who was the majority leader of the Senate and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Orrin Hatch, that blocked all of the nominations from any hearing at all, refused to give them a single hearing. And it turns out that Orrin Hatch's son, maybe a little known fact from people from Utah, was the director of the Federalist Society, which is this extreme right-wing element. There may even be a chapter of them on the campus here, even though there may be only 3 or 4 people in it. But so you may run into these people. But because of this fact, the trajectory of justice here in the springtime of 2019 is decidedly downward with regard to the protection of fundamental rights of citizens. It's not only downward in the judicial branch, but it's downward in the legislative branch because of the capture of the Senate on the part of the reactionaries in the Republican Party. And of course, the executive branch under Donald Trump is dominated by primarily people from the oil corporations. As you remember, Rex Tillerson, who was the first of the secretaries of state for the Trump administration, was the CEO of ExxonMobil and the head of the Environmental Protection Agency was the Attorney General from Oklahoma, another major oil corporation state, who had lodged over a dozen major federal lawsuits against the Environmental Protection Agency and was made the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, was appointed to be the Secretary of Energy to explore potential alternatives to oil, except that he happened to turn out to be the vice president of the Sunoco Oil Corporation. So that you see right at the beginning of this administration in the executive branch, you had an entire captive executive branch by the oil corporations. And Donald Trump was actually one of the partners of the Energy Transfer Partners Corporation that were the sponsors of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And the second action of Trump after coming to office in January of 2019, or 2017 rather, his first action, as you know, was to issue the executive order banning all Islamic people, all Muslim people from coming into the United States. He had to go through 2 or 3 different iterations of that executive order for it to stop being struck down by the federal courts. And the second action that he undertook on the 24th of January of 2017 was to issue an executive order ordering the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to grant an easement for the Dakota Access Pipeline and for the Keystone XL pipeline, no matter how much they violated the environmental protection rules and regulations, because there was an emergency situation of the need for domestic oil, he said. And it was after they commenced the construction of those pipelines pursuant to the issuance of those easements. It was only later that he then issued another executive order authorizing the drilling for oil and the mining of coal and the drilling for natural gas on all Indian reservations in the country, followed by his order authorizing the exploration for oil and coal and gas inside all national parks in the United States. And so that this administration has never been accused of being subtle about what it is that it's doing. And it was transparent that they were very much in the pocket of the oil corporations. And of course, it was just as obvious that they were in the pocket of other major corporations as well, because of the proposed income tax changes for all corporations that were advocated by the Trump administration, that cutting dramatically the taxes that had to be paid by the corporations, so that you get major corporations such as Amazon and others who make literally billions and billions of dollars of profits every single year, paying zero for income tax. And you get this massive drop in income coming in through the taxing structures, and then they move to start cutting all of the social programs because they think that they're too expensive. And since they have less money coming in now, they have to cut all of these social programs. So that they're proposing, the one you heard the most about, is of course Betsy Voss, who is the Secretary of Education, canceling all funding for the Special Olympics. And what you don't know, probably, most of you don't know, is that Betsy Voss is the sister of Eric Prince, who is the founder and director of Blackwater International, which is the largest major private military in the United States and the world. It actually has battalion size military units now to be able to deploy in the hire of private corporations. They actually have fighter jets now in Blackwater International. They have fighter jets, and they have Sherman tanks. They have armored personnel carriers. They have their entire military cadres. And virtually all of the employees in Blackwater International and in Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation are all U.S. Army Special Forces that the United States has spent literally billions of dollars training and then deploying in the Middle East to capture and to maintain control over the oil fields in the Middle East. Now, I point this out in the context of giving a general overview of what the trajectory of justice looks like here in the spring of 2019. It's not going up and up and up at the present time. But on the other hand, we also know that under Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and others, there is a major counter force that is underway right now. There's been a substantial increase in the number of members of the Progressive Caucus in the United States Congress. There are now 104 members of the Progressive Caucus out of 435 members of the House. And there's a major campaign that's underway right now on the part of the progressive movement to increase the number of members of the House of Representatives who will be elected in 2020, who are progressives, that will then come into the Progressive Caucus. Hopefully, they will be able to bring the number up to as many as maybe 170 members of the 435 members of Congress, but that will give them a majority control of the Democratic Party caucus in the House of Representatives. So there's both some good news and bad news going on right now about the trajectory of justice. But what I want to do is I want to be able to put this dynamic into the context of global climate change. As you know and you remember that almost 60% of Northern California was burnt to the ground in the last 2 and 3 years. The huge fires in Paradise last year, the fires before that in Lake County, then the major fires that were down in Los Angeles, down in the big valley, Imperial Valley. That this and the massive tornadoes that are going on now, the huge hurricanes that have gone on down in Texas, the hurricane that hit Florida, the massive flooding that is at the present time, the Missouri River is overflowing and it's flooding out The Pine Ridge Reservation right now is largely underwater. A lot of our staff are up there right now coordinating getting FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in to actually help the Native people, because the Trump administration is maintaining that that is a sovereign territory, and that therefore they may not need to actually provide federal emergency management services to them. So our people are up there now helping to negotiate to get assistance for the people there. But so that the process of global climate change descending on the planet is driving literally millions of people from their homes, because there's a rapid increase in the desertification of the major deserts creeping into the potable water areas. There, as you well know, the massive melting of the ice caps, now starting to go over into the melting of the ice sheets themselves in both the north and the south pole areas of Antarctica and the Arctic. And the dangers are going to be discussed in this class, because it would be absolutely irresponsible for a university not to be sharing this information with you in your generation right now, to help you prepare about what to do about this, about how to do everything you can in your power to stop it from getting worse, how to accommodate the inevitable consequences of what has happened already, and try to cope with some of these consequences. There are going to be millions and millions of environmental refugees. I mean, if they think they're having trouble right now with people trying to come up out of Central America because of the drug gangs and the violence down there, when the fuller consequences of global climate change start to manifest, it's going to render nugatory almost the kind of problems they're having right now with immigration. And what you're going to see is people coming in from the seacoasts, for example, that the people flooding in, as it were, from the seacoasts, coming in and moving into other people's space, and those people resenting it and resisting them and refusing to share resources with them. And there's going to be major conflicts. The United States Defense Department knows this. There are all types of programs going on inside the Defense Department and the Pentagon, planning to deploy U.S. troops into these areas to try to quell violence between the onrushing flood of people coming in from the coasts and the people who live there. And there are other more indirect consequences that people don't talk about. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that you, in this class, get the basic information that you may be just hearing about sort of in the corner of your ear going on in the media about different things. And every once in a while you'll see an article about it and you'll turn your attention to it and read up on it and hear about some of the things that are expected to happen. But we want to give you an opportunity to have sort of a full presentation of this. And John Conway, who is one of the TAs in the course here, this is Chris here, who's going to be videoing all of these things and making them available for you. If for any reason you happen to miss a class, that they're going to be available for you to be able to review the videos of the class. But John is a PhD graduate of the University of California at Santa Barbara in environmental sciences, and he knows all of the latest information about the potential consequences of global climate change, and he's going to be sharing them with you. This first week, today we're going to be just going over the course materials, sort of 1 mile wide and like 1 foot deep. Throughout the rest of the 10 weeks, we're going to be going 1 mile wide and about 1 mile deep on a lot of this information. And John is going to be lecturing in week 2 to lay out the details and the specifics of global climate change, so that you'll understand that the whole rest of the course that we're talking about is going to be in the context of this global climate change that's taking place. and trying to understand, what it is we can all do to prevent the worst consequences of this. But some of the more subtle things that you might not immediately know about is, for example, that with the melting of the polar ice caps, and if it starts to move into the melting of the ice sheets, or the land glaciers on the land, that's going to cause a massive acceleration of the melting of that. And that fresh water pouring into the ocean can reduce the solidity of the water, so that the actual content of the water changes and the density of the ocean water changes, and it causes the underwater currents to rise to the surface and dissipate. And it's some of those underwater currents that actually generate the temperate zone on our planet, where a substantial portion of the food is grown on the planet. And the rising of the sea levels, which you've heard so much about. One thing you don't know, probably, almost certainly, is that there are 402 private nuclear power plants, all within 2 miles of the coastlines of our planet. And so that what you heard about going on with the Fukushima in Japan, that the massive inundation of that nuclear power plant, and the explosion of the core, and the massive, as we sit here today, massive pumping of tens of thousands of gallons of radioactive water out into the Pacific Ocean right now, to try to keep those reactors from melting down and setting off a massive contamination of large portions of Japan. This is just one facility, and there are over 400 of them along the seacoasts, such that when the sea rise starts, that it's not only going to invade those nuclear power plants unless they're shut down beforehand, and those radioactive materials are removed from the site and transported away from those areas. Now, these are just some of the kind of things that we're going to be talking about here. And when you see this rise of the right wing coming into not only the United States, but you see the forces in Europe coming to the fore. You see in Brazil, a major fascist is now attained the presidency there. The head of the Philippines is another hardcore right-wing fascist. That one of the issues that we're going to be talking about in this course is, why is this happening? Why is there this resurgence in fascists, coming to power around the world? And what we're going to point out is that this process has started with the demise of the Soviet Union. That we can give you a lot of inside information on this. I was the chief counsel for the United States Jesuit Order headquarters in Washington, D.C., in their social ministry office, in charge of policy for the entire United States with regard to all kinds of different issues. And it was in that context that we came to have fairly good inside information about the things that are going on, and we're able to share that information with you here. That's one of the reasons why I'm always so pleased to be invited to come and teach here every spring, because I can actually share with you things that you're never going to find out anywhere else. You're not going to read about it anywhere. It's not going to be in any of the documentaries that you see. So I can help share some of that information with you. Because out of my office, for example, in Washington, D.C., Dr. James Garrison, who was my best friend at Harvard Divinity School. After I'd graduated from law school in the college, I'd gone to the Divinity School to do my master's work there. And I met Dr. Jim Garrison there working on his master's degree. He went to Cambridge in England to do his PhD work while I was doing my work at Harvard Divinity School. And he came onto my staff at Jesuit headquarters, and he is the one who we dispatched to Russia to meet with Brezhnev back in 1979 and 80, and then later with Shevardnadze, he was, and eventually with Gorbachev, to actually discuss the dismantling of nuclear weapons, mutual dismantling of nuclear weapons that nobody knows anything about, but you will. And we'll share that information with you, which led to the beginning of glasnost and perestroika with Gorbachev. And I ended up being one of the directors, along with Dr. Jim Garrison, and our executive director at the Romero Institute, Sarah Nelson. She was the executive director of the State of the World Forum at the end of the Cold War, inviting all former presidents, vice presidents, secretary of state, secretaries of defense to all come together once each year up in San Francisco to hold major meetings about what to do there at the end of the Cold War to try to prevent the rising of another long-time dialectic between good guys and bad guys that went on during the entire period of the Cold War for basically 75 years. Given the fact that the Cold War didn't really start in 1945, like everybody tries to convince you, it started back in 1917, as soon as the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar Nicholas II, and the United States dispatched a foreign military expeditionary force into Russia, which I dare say none of you have ever even heard about. And here you are sitting at a major university, and you don't even know that the United States sent a foreign military expeditionary force into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution back in 1917. And so that these are the kind of things that you're going to find out about during this course. And you're going to see that in our negotiations with Gorbachev, to get him to agree to step back from the Cold War and agree to start to dismantle some of the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union, that what happened here in the United States was, rather than drop back and start cutting back on our U.S. military budget, on the Monday morning following December 31st of 1991, when Gorbachev signed the decree releasing all of the republics from the Union of Soviet Republics, as soon as he did that, the following Monday morning, in the George Bush Sr. administration at that time in 1991, the Secretary of Defense of which was who? Secretary of Defense for George Bush Sr. So you see why we're here. So we're here to talk about this because it was Dick Cheney. Okay? And the problem with the courses and stuff that you have is there's so much that they don't tell you about and that you don't have any reason to know because you're not given the information. And so what we have done out of our offices, we have put together this information so that it makes sense to you, so that you can see why it is that certain things are happening that isn't shared with you as a rule. And the reason that it's not shared with you as a rule is because there is a certain governing elite in the country that shares power back and forth between the Republican and Democratic Party, and they don't have any great interest in getting all the citizenry trained up to really understand everything. You know, so that what they're doing is they're trying to train you to go and get a job, you know, to sell real estate, you know, to sell insurance because of the insurance corporations and to work for the big corporations. And the fact is what we're here to do is try to train you to become revolutionaries instead. So that what you'll do is you'll actually come forward to try to protect, for example, the Constitution of the United States, that you'll try to protect fundamental rights of individuals against the collective, that you'll begin to understand historically what the situation is that we're in at the present time. And that, for example, I want you to talk to your other friends here at school and to talk them into coming to the class. because, you can go to a whole lot of boring classes. I don't mean to knock out the other courses. But what I'm saying is here that you aren't going to have any course in the entire time you spend here at the university that is going to be more informative than this course is, and more important for you in really understanding what's going on in the world, okay? And it's going to keep you from having to get into fights with your parents when you go home, because you can explain it to them, and you can point out what it is that's happening in the world, and you'll be able to cite the sources of the information, so you'll know that. For example, you're going to be able to talk with your parents and your friends and your relatives for next Thanksgiving, for example, when they come to the house. You can tell them that, on the Monday morning following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Defense Department people in the George Bush Senior administration under Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz was his deputy director, and they convened a meeting in the West Wing of the White House on the Monday morning following December 31st of 1991, and they sat down and crafted the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. Now that's something that you go your whole life never knowing even existed. But they drafted up the first draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, in which they said the following. They said, oh look, the Soviet Union has now dissolved, and so therefore, we are the last and only remaining superpower on the planet. We're going to be getting a lot of pressure to try to cut back on our United States military budget, because for the last 75 years, we've been saying that we have to have a huge military, spending hundreds of billions of dollars every single year in order to protect us against the Soviet Union taking over the world. That's our job. What they said is that rather than cutting back on our U.S. military budget, what we ought to do is increase it so that we can establish, and I want to see some pencils moving on your paper here, so that we can establish full spectrum dominance over the planet. And that the purpose of the full spectrum dominance would be to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that are needed by our country, okay? When the first draft of that was circulated in April of 1992 to certain select members of the cabinet and certain select generals at the Pentagon, someone leaked a copy of it to the Washington Post. They wrote an editorial against it, and they said, this is terrible. This is a return to gunboat diplomacy that characterized the age of American imperialism back during the robber baron era that went on from at the end of the American Civil War in 1868 to 1898, and they said this should not be acceptable. Now, and the fact is, that was a very astute insight, because that's exactly what happened at the end of the Cold War. At the end of that period of the Bolsheviks being in charge in the Soviet Union and establishing this major worldwide socialist momentum, that what happened as soon as they stepped back from that contest, the reactionaries inside the United States governing circles said, why shouldn't we go right back to what we were doing before that started? Just like we were doing during the robber baron era, between 1868 and 1898. Why don't we get right back to that, establishing full spectrum dominance, pursuing our manifest destiny to be in charge of the world? And what happened is the Washington Post criticized it, and the New York Times followed the following Sunday with the Sunday Times, issuing another editorial against it. And George Bush Sr., very rarely do they ever say anything about classified documents, but he issued a public statement saying, we're not acknowledging that any such proposal exists. But if it did, it would only be a first draft, and we may be doing another draft of this. And he, in fact, did do another draft of it. The second draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document was co-authored by George H.W. Bush himself and a man by the name of Theodore G. Shackley. Now, I don't anticipate that there's anybody here among the students that has the slightest idea of who Theodore G. Shackley is, again, because you've never been told. Theodore Shackley was the hand-picked director of worldwide covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency, hand-picked by George H.W. Bush when he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency under Gerald Ford from 1975 to 1977. And Theodore Shackley was, for 26 years, the deputy to Major General Reinhard Gehlen, the commander of the Waffen-SS Third Reich Anti-Soviet and Anti-Eastern Bloc Intelligence Unit. And Theodore Shackley was his deputy for 26 years. And they founded together a major academy called the Anti-Communist Special Operations Training Academy. Okay? It's in a place called Oberammergau in Bavaria. They trained between 1947 and 1965. They trained 1,200 men from all the different Western powers, including Israel in the Mossad, trained them on anti-communist special warfare tactics. And they spread these men out across the world, and they were inside all the intelligence agencies of the Western powers. And these men were more loyal to each other horizontally than they were to their own governments vertically. And they worked together in liaison over the period of the Cold War to overthrow democratic regimes, to assassinate populist movements that were not supporting the United States corporations and being able to exploit the resources of the country, et cetera. And this Theodore Shackley was the man who in 1962, actually in the fall of 1961, was actually brought on board back from Berlin, where he'd been serving as the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen and the new West German intelligence. They brought him back and made him the CIA station chief in Miami, Florida, where they ran the covert operations against Cuba, which included the putting together of a major political assassination team to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. And all you've ever heard about that is, oh yes, I remember hearing something about that there was a major set of investigations that went on in the United States Senate called the Church Committee under Senator Frank Church from Idaho, who investigated this and found out that there was an assassination team trying to kill Castro. Okay? But that's all you know. Okay? What you don't know is that's the same team that assassinated the president in Dallas. And they're not going to tell you about that. And they're not going to tell you that Lyndon Johnson, when he became president, had to go and get on top of Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time, to get him to agree to chair the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of the president. And specifically said, the reason you have to come on and be the head of this is because I need you to keep quiet the fact that there was this assassination team that was put together to kill Castro. Because if, in fact, it gets out that there was such a team, that everybody's going to assume that, that Kennedy must have authorized that assassination team, whereas, in fact, it was Richard Nixon that set up the assassination team back in 1960 when he was the vice president under Eisenhower. And they're going to assume that Kennedy authorized the assassination team, and therefore they're going to suspect that it was Fidel Castro that must have assassinated the president. And there's going to be World War III. And so that you, as the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, have to come on and head up this commission to keep secret the fact that this assassination team even existed. Okay? So there's things like that that you're going to find out about during this course that you don't know about and that you wouldn't know about. Okay? And that there's a lot of these things. And when you discover that group of assassins operated out of the Miami station of the CIA, and it was Theodore Shackley that was the new head of the Miami station of the CIA, and that Theodore Shackley was the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen for 26 years, and that they founded this major academy, the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy, that was training all of these guys, and they were running political assassinations all around the world to assassinate not only people that were communists, but assassinating people that were socialists. They were assassinating people that were liberals. They were assassinating people who were librarians because they were allowing people to read books in areas where they had authoritarian dictators put in place who didn't want the people reading books. So you've got to understand that there is a radical perception of the world that you have not yet been exposed to. And that's why you came to college, was to be able to find out things like this. But the problem is that you're not finding out things like this until now. And that's why we have this course, is to be able to teach you about these things. And it's extremely important that you understand that when you get to the end of this course after 10 weeks, it's not going to be that you're all brokenhearted and dispirited and think that things are terrible and you're going to want to jump out of a first-story window somewhere. The fact of the matter is that what you will be is you will be disillusioned. And it's very important that you become disillusioned first, because it certainly doesn't do you any good to continue to be illusioned, okay? But you can't stay there. You can't stay in that condition of just being disillusioned. You have to try to understand what the positive information is that exists on which you can build with others to be able to make real the fundamental and profound insights that exist in the Constitution of the United States. To understand what the underpinnings are of fundamental human rights that are set forth in the Bill of Rights. You need to understand, however, that there was this fundamental conflict that was going on right at the very founding of the Constitution itself, where you had these Jeffersonians and the Madisonians that were advocating the fundamental rights of individuals, that insisted upon having a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And there was, on the other hand, the Hamiltonians, that Alexander Hamilton, everybody's cheering about because they have a Broadway play about him, right? But in that they even have a black guy playing him. You know, I mean, who could ask for more? You know, how about finding out who Alexander Hamilton really was? That he was the lawyer for the financial bankers in the colonies, and that they're the ones that refused to allow the people to vote for senators originally. They're the ones that insisted upon having an electoral college, for example. They're the ones that believed that there was an elite that had to govern the country, and that the other people, in order to vote, you had to be a white, male property owner. And that there's been this struggle that has gone on, you know, ever since 1789, with the passage of the original Constitution itself, in 1791 with the Bill of Rights. There's been a struggle on behalf of the Madisonians to try to carve into that type of elite, to try to move into positions of influencing the policies that are being made. And yet, on the other hand, you're going to read an article that we've assigned. That on the other hand, if you were to just say, let's have everybody in the entire country vote on every single thing that gets done by the government, you know, when you understand that 24% of the American public thinks that the sun rotates around the earth. That's not good news, you know. That the fact of the matter is our public has not been adequately educated to participate effectively in the democratic process. And that is not coincidental. Because as Reinhold, who was it? Reinhold, what's that? Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner once said, he says, you know, if you allow the state to control the schools, they will teach the students to obey the same people that run the state. Always. And it happens from the time you're in high school. You know, oh, you have to respect the teachers, have to respect the principal, you have to respect, the faculty, you have to do all that. All I said, you have to respect the law enforcement officer, you have to respect the president. The whole theory behind the Constitution of the United States is you're not supposed to trust these people. You're not supposed to trust them. What you have to do is you need to understand what all the issues are all the time. You need to participate in the decision-making process, and you cannot simply lend blind loyalty to them. That's what democracy is all about. And so this course at base is about you becoming trained as leaders in your generation to help others mobilize to assert your power and your control over policies, rather than sitting back and allowing an elite to govern and have us all just be spectators. Because you see what this is getting us. Global climate change, for example. And no matter how much information you keep pouring into them, they all just slow walk the whole response to global climate change because they don't want to offend the major corporations who are funding their elections. And it isn't as though they're subtle about it much anymore. They've got Citizens United now, decided by this new, more reactionary Supreme Court, has actually said that corporations are people and they have a right to give as much money as they want to candidates. Well, why shouldn't they? This is a free country, and they're people just like everybody else, a corporation, and you say to yourself, where did that come from? How did corporations all of a sudden get to be people? And what is it that explains why it is they don't have fundamental rights like individuals? Which means you have to really understand why it is you have fundamental rights as individual human beings. And this is another thing that you don't get taught. What is the fundamental theory behind why it is that you have fundamental rights? Okay? Now, because there's one whole school of thought that thinks that you have fundamental rights that are donated to you by the elite that set up the Constitution of the United States, and they granted you free speech. And they granted you freedom of religion. And they did this primarily for utilitarian purposes. Because if you didn't have free speech, you wouldn't be able to engage in constructive discussions, and you couldn't help the state. You couldn't help the government function. Okay, so that what they say is, therefore, if you want to have free expression by being able to paint certain kinds of art, and that doesn't meet the utilitarian need of helping the state run, you don't have that right. It's a very different theory of your fundamental rights. It's what they call the donative theory of fundamental rights, rather than the inherent fundamental rights that you possess. The source of the fundamental rights that you possess that are inherent to your humanity flow from the natural law concept, which is the root of the Constitution of the United States. And so we'll be talking about that, okay? You get to actually think about this stuff. I'm trying to be of assistance. I was very fortunate. I ended up getting a full scholarship to Harvard College. My father was the first Sheehan man ever to graduate from high school. Okay? But I was very fortunate in getting a full boat scholarship to Harvard College, a full boat scholarship to Harvard Law School, and then came back and studied at Harvard Divinity School on comparative social ethics, and have gotten to do a lot of things during the course of my life so far. And I want you guys to have access to the same kind of opportunities that I got. So what I'm doing is trying to bring some of the information that I've been able to obtain in the course of the last 50 years to share it with you, so that the fact that you didn't happen to go to Harvard or Yale or another one, but you're here, you still have the same opportunity to find out the same stuff. Okay? But it's going to take some work on your part. And so when we have a discussion about global climate change, and John Conway explains a lot of these details to you, I want to make sure that you're getting it. So I want to have you do a paper. The first paper is going to be, I think, in April 28th. We have the whole month here together when we're going to be sort of concentrating at the beginning of it, at least, on global climate change. And I want you to write a paper about global climate change. We'll talk about it later, to really learn what the details of this are. And it's not memorization and remembering statistics and all that, but to say something important about global climate change, to think something important about global climate change, and to do something important about global climate change. And then we're going to have in May, in the middle of May, we'll have another paper which is going to be dealing with the impeachment. We haven't talked an awful lot about that here, but I mean, as you know right now, I mean, there was this big goose egg that just got laid, by Mueller. Everybody was all sitting around waiting for Mueller to prove that Trump was a communist stooge, from the Soviet Union, or for Russia, that he was just, had become a dupe of Russia, and everybody's sitting back waiting for Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller was the FBI director for George W. Bush. And what's that tell you? And William Barr was the Attorney General for George Bush Sr. That William Barr is the one that recommended to George Bush Sr. that he give pardons to all of the people that were indicted in the Iran-Contra investigation by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, so they couldn't be pressured into testifying against him, who was helping to run the entire Ilopango air operation of smuggling weapons to the Contras in complete defiance of a congressional ban. A clear, unabrogated, impeachable offense. And you don't have to take my word for it. That's the word directly from Tip O'Neill. When I sat down and talked with Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, and showed him what the information was, he said to me, "Whoa," he said, these are impeachable offenses. And I said, yes, they are. And so he agreed to set up, if the Democrats could win back the Senate in the fall of 1986, that was, that they would have signed a special task force out of the Senate to investigate this, and that they would impeach George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey and others in the administration. But they didn't. Okay? Just like they didn't impeach a whole lot of other people that should have been impeached, because the citizens were not participating enough in it. They couldn't force the elite to jettison one of their own. Okay? They would just work out ways of trying to get them to calm down and stop doing things that were so excessive. And we're going to cover a whole lot of actions that were undertaken by different presidents at different times that should have, in fact, led to their impeachment. Not the least of which was Lyndon Johnson setting up this bogus Warren Commission and talking Earl Warren into concealing the very group that killed the president. And to say nothing about Lyndon Johnson needing to get impeached because he completely fabricated the Bay of Tonkin incident for the whole Vietnam War. Just completely fabricated that and lied to the Congress and told them that the USS Henry Knox had been attacked by a North Vietnamese patrol boat, on the high seas, and therefore we needed to send 500,000 United States military to invade and occupy Southeast Asia. You would think that would get you impeached, but no, it didn't. Nor did it get W. Bush impeached. Just to fabricate this whole story about how Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and they paraded all of their cabinet members out on the news shows on Sunday morning, every Sunday, telling how, we have to stop Saddam Hussein because he's developing a nuclear weapon, and, we're going to be confronted with a mushroom cloud over New York City. Absolutely, totally proven that was a total lie. And it was manufactured by the W. Bush administration. And the guy that they hired to be the public relations firm for that, a fellow by the name of Mark Feifel, who headed up a thing called the Behind the Scenes Public Relations Company, who was brought into Standing Rock to draft up all of the speeches for the Morton County Sheriff's Department. And you say, wow, that's weird. But it turns out it's not. It turns out it's just completely consistent with how they do things, and that you think they do things differently. So it seems weird. So what we're going to be doing here in this course is kind of helping you get a better perspective on things that are going on, the big things that are going on in your life. Global climate change, potential impeachment of Trump, and this whole rise of a progressive element inside the Democratic Party attempting to gain control over the Democratic Party and want to impeach Trump. Whereas the new, more moderate Democratic Party, led by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the others, do not want to impeach him. And what is it they say why they don't want to impeach him? Tell me, what is it that Nancy Pelosi is saying as to why it is she doesn't want to impeach Donald Trump? A guy who's like a borderline moron, who lies every single minute he talks and is a complete incompetence mentis, and they can't bring themselves to impeach him. What is it? What's the reason she's giving for why she doesn't want to do that? What?
It's infeasible. It's not going to be ratified in the Senate.
No. It's too disruptive. It's too disruptive. What they really mean is they're afraid of this 10 to 12% of the people that Lincoln, remember the famous thing Lincoln said, is you can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. These are the people that you can fool all the time. This is they. The people who believe that the sun orbits around the earth, etc. And there's a portion of them among the American citizenry. And the compassionate fact is that it's not really all their fault. I mean, they live in red states, and they listen to Fox News all the time. Wherever you go, in the restaurants, in the bars, the Fox News is playing all the time. They've got these radio stations, that just pour vitriol out on the American Civil Liberties Union and other things all the time about how they're all communists trying to take over our country. And that's how the people are raised, So we have to be able to penetrate into these people around the country. We have to dramatically improve the education system in our country. There are a whole series of things that we need to do, but these are doable. These are doable. But you have to know more than you know now in order to be adequately motivated to do what it is you need to do. Because I'm hoping that when you get done taking this course, it's going to motivate you to do things that you would never have done before. Okay? That you're going to take more and more responsibility for the country, more and more responsibility for the lives of your friends and your neighbors, and that's what you're going to do.